This is the 6th in our series of webinars looking at local climate issues, which inevitably turn out to be national or possibly even global issues. For those who haven't joined before, Derek Thomas, our MP, is here, but he is in London and he has to join a health debate shortly. So he's listening, but he's not very much in evidence. I'm sorry about that. Megan McClary is the constituency business administrator who manages all our Zoom issues and invitations and generally keeps us organised. I'm hoping Jonathan Howe is here, who's one of our starter members and who is the first Green Mayor of Penzance. My name's Pippa Stilwell and I'm a WI Climate Ambassador, so we've been working on these for a while. Could I ask you, when you join, to put your name and organisation in the chat, and then when you have a question, put it in the Q&A, and we'll answer as many as we can during the course of the afternoon. Jonathan, I don't know how long you can stay, but there's only Megan and I doing the Q&A, so if you could stay for a bit and help out, that would be excellent. Okay, so at our first webinar in February, we hosted speakers from local climate action groups, and Catherine Lewis from Helston described her work on teaching climate change in schools. She also put me in touch with the youth-led organisation Teach the Future, which our first speaker, Bea Harrison, will tell you about. I know there is lots of good work happening in Cornwall, but it has to be extracurricular, whereas there's a very good argument for putting the teaching of climate literacy on the core curriculum. We wanted to start a conversation amongst people who are not necessarily educationalists, but who can amplify the discussion in the community. And WI members are a good example because there's 250,000 of us. So we need to prepare all our young people for careers in the green technologies or nature-based solutions of the future, as well as for challenges facing us all as emissions continue to rise. If not all of us have quite woken up to this necessity, young people have, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Bea Harrison, a 16-year-old student climate activist from the youth-led group Teach the Future. Teach the Future is a volunteer-led campaign which lobbies for broad climate education to equip students with the micro-credentials needed for a sustainable and just society. And Bea has been campaigning with Teach the Future since November 2020. So over to you, Bea.
Hi, so I'm Bea, and I'm going to start off by introducing a bit about Teach the Future and what we do. So we are a UK-wide youth-led organisation who campaigns for climate action, education and justice in the political realm, as well as focusing on grassroots community projects. So we were established in September 2019 by a student and a fellow climate activist, Joe Brindle, who wanted to do something meaningful during his gap year. Since then, our campaign has really taken off. For example, in February 2020, we held a political reception in the House of Parliament, which over 150 MPs attended and listened to our asks. Additionally, we have a petition which can be found on our website, which was signed by over 26,000 people approximately. And yes, so I previously mentioned our asks, which we have on our website and mentioned a lot in our political reception. And we have 3 main asks. So one is to teach students about climate change. As simple as it may sound, so we discovered as part of a research project that we funded that only 4% of students feel that they have been taught sufficiently about climate education, and 70% of teachers feel unable to accurately teach climate education. This needs to change. If we are to achieve the societal lifestyle shift required, then people must understand how and why they should contribute to the solution on an individual level and be empowered to rally against institutional obstinacy. Education is the only way to close the knowledge gap between our actions and consequences. So 2, our second ask, include green skills in many vocational courses. The UK needs a workforce able to bring us to net zero emissions and make us world leaders in sustainable technologies. Therefore, vocational courses need to include the green skills required to achieve this. And 3, to make educational buildings climate friendly. Our education buildings play an essential role in how and what we learn. By retrofitting them to net zero emissions by 2030, we can create green jobs across the country and inspire students to live sustainably. We have calculated the cost of retrofitting all England educational settings to be £23 billion. However, in the most recent update of the Skills and Jobs White Paper, only £1.5 billion was proposed to be spent on improving these buildings, with no mention of carbon neutrality or sustainable buildings in all 80 pages. So overarching these 3 main asks is the idea that we like to call the golden thread. So a broad climate education will empower every young person to contribute to a more resilient and sustainable society. The golden thread idea is that climate education must be implemented to a sufficient degree in every single subject, because not everyone wants to be a climate scientist, and yet the climate crisis will affect every single one of us. Many world leaders speak of a green economy, but how will the next generation of workers support this ideal if they are not equipped with an appropriate understanding of how their sector contributes to the solution? So with this golden thread idea in mind, I would like to take the opportunity to emphasize the importance of personal stories, not just statistics, when talking about and approaching climate education. When communicating and educating on the climate crisis, just imagine it's the last period on a Friday, the students are more focused on the 5 minutes left on the clock than the numbers that are being written on the board by the teacher. If the teacher were to tell them that the average number of people exposed to heat waves has increased by approximately 125 million since the beginning of the century, do you think the students would care? Maybe. But if the climate crisis is relayed in a local, personal context, for example, that climate change is already upon us, with the fact that the visible impacts of this has increased flooding, wind, rain, and storm intensities in Cornwall, with hidden impacts such as droughts, biosecurity, and the risk of invasive species. If we introduce these personal stories, it will trigger emotions, and emotion is persuasion. Emotions are motivation, and it's key to closing the gap between knowledge and action. So, Mr. Derek Thomas, in May 2019, wrote an article on how the Climate Change Council, the CCC report, recommends that the UK go to net zero emissions by 2050. In this, he emphasises the recommendations made by the CCC report, including those of increased tree planting as a form of carbon sequestering and ecosystem improvement, the need to improve our leaky, energy inefficient homes, and it also recommends banning the sales of new petrol and diesel cars by 2035. But it also recommends enabling people to act. This last point is described as perhaps the most important of all. The fact that the report recommends that the public should understand why and what changes are needed to see a benefit from making low carbon choices and being able to access the resources required to make change happen. I fully support any movement to help people understand how to live more sustainably and make greener choices. Thank you, and I hope I can answer any questions later on.
Thank you very much, Bea. That was absolutely excellent, and it's given everybody much food for thought, and I shall access the recording later on and listen to it again. So well done, and many thanks. Well, our next speaker is Caroline Hickman, who is a lecturer at the University of Bath. She is a psychotherapist and a board member of the Climate Psychology Alliance, which is shortened to the CPA. Caroline works with schools, parent groups, youth activist groups, and as a psychotherapist with children, young people, and adults dealing with eco-anxiety and distress about the climate and biodiversity crisis. She's also creating a series of podcasts on climate psychology and eco-anxiety. So a warm welcome, Caroline, and many thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Pippa, and thank you, Bea, for a brilliant talk, as always. I'm just going to share my screen because I've got some pictures I want to use as we go. So when my computer finally, there we go. So thank you. So I'm going to talk about the psychology of the climate and biodiversity crisis and why we need a psychological understanding. One of the main arguments around this is that we have had the solutions, we've known about the problems for decades and struggled to act, even though we've had the solutions. And yes, of course, we need economic and political understanding as to why we've struggled to act, but we also need a psychological understanding in order that we don't fall into or collapse into greenwashing, or also get caught in this narrative that you'll probably be very familiar with, which is between the naive optimism, which is, oh, it'll be all right, versus the doom and gloom pessimism, which is, it's all going to be terrible. The reality is that neither of these are completely true. Both of those are an attempt to escape from the uncertainty that we are inevitably facing. But this isn't a passive uncertainty, this is a radical uncertainty. So we have to be able psychologically to navigate our way through this. There is no blueprint or map psychologically for what we're facing at the moment. So we need to use the psychological models that we've got to help us build a map and a pathway through this. And this involves things like radical hope, radical creative ideas. Things are not looking that good at the moment, but that brings huge risks and also huge opportunities. I've been working and doing research with children and young people for about 10 years. And pre-COVID, I sat in a park in Bath with a group of young people and asked them what they wanted from education to prepare them to deal with the climate emergency. And they said to me, they want lessons in the following. They want lessons in boat building. They want lessons in how to build houses. They want lessons in which plants are safe to eat and how to name trees, how to grow their own food. But they also said to me, they want lessons in how to have difficult conversations with parents. And they also said to me, they want lessons in school on how to lobby politicians. So I thought this was rather an excellent new curriculum for the future, which includes the practical, but also the relational understanding from children and young people, that in order to support them in playing their part in finding the solutions, we have to also respond as adults. We have to respond in terms of mental health, but we also have to respond through the curriculum, through schools. And increasingly, children and young people are being left feeling frustrated, abandoned, betrayed, terrified, not specifically because of ecological problems that they see going on. It's not specifically because of climate change. That is frightening and that is worrying. But what children and young people are frightened of is the failure of adults to take it seriously and the failure of adults to act. So when it comes to eco-anxiety and distress in children and young people, the solution to that lies with adults. We need to increase the anxiety and the concern in adults in order to reduce it in children. And children are increasingly taking people to court. There's a group of children in Portugal at the moment, 6 children in Portugal, who are currently suing 33 European governments in the European Court of Human Rights because of failure to act on climate change is a contravention of their human rights. We need to take these things very seriously. And the UK is one of the governments being sued. So I'm going to frame this psychologically as a journey. How can we move from eco-anxiety and distress to eco-aliveness, eco-care, eco-community? And I'm going to talk this through very, very quickly, but I will share these slides with Pippa. So the Climate Psychology Alliance says we need to face these difficult truths, not run away from them and not listen to greenwashing, but we need to face the reality of what's going on out there, because we are living in a time where things without precedent are unfolding in front of our eyes. Look at the rainfall in London yesterday. A month's worth of rain fell in 24 hours. This is unprecedented. Look at the wildfires, look at the heat domes. So we are living with this. We are witnessing these catastrophic rates of extinction and exhaustion and runaway climate change. And psychologically, emotionally, relationally, it's hard to witness this. So psychologically, we want to sort of minimize it and say, oh, it's not that bad, or, oh, we'll do something, or technology will save us. The problem is that's locating the problem in the individual. This is a social problem, and this is a problem of global injustice. And unless we frame it that way, psychologically and systemically, we will not take sufficient action. And this is what's creating this anxiety about whether we will take enough action early enough to stop the spread of the more extreme impacts that are already appearing globally. Millions of people are already dying globally. So yes, we have to look at this locally, but that local empathy has to connect to a global crisis. And to feel this is an emotionally healthy response. We measure mental health by looking at people's capacity to respond to external reality. So really, I would be terribly worried about somebody who wasn't worried about what's happening in the world. There are lots of pieces of research being done, a lot focused on children and young people. I've only got the young people's statistics here. It's very similar with adults, but the UN Development Programme with Oxford University last year looked at 1.2 million people in 50 countries. Nearly 70% of under 18 said that climate change was a global emergency. The Royal College of Psychiatrists last year reported 57% of child and adolescent psychiatrists were seeing children and young people who were distressed. There's so much research and statistics now showing us that this is becoming an emergent, significant mental health problem. And of course, this is on a range from mild feelings, which are transient and can respond to reassurance with a focus on optimism and hope, particularly hope in others, through medium and significant to severe. As a psychotherapist, I am seeing young people with severe emotional experience of eco-anxiety, feeling suicidal. Their feeling of security in the world is severely threatened. They're losing their capacity to trust adults to take action. Again, this is not me giving you a doom and gloom message. This is, we need to take this seriously. And all of these feelings psychologically make perfect sense. Anxiety, grief, nostalgia, which is grief for loss of a particular place, hope and hopelessness. This is what it means to build an emotionally resilient, emotionally intelligent approach to this. We need to feel some anger and some blame and frustration and guilt. We need to have fantasies of rescue, and we need to feel despair. All of these feelings have their place, and to be able to feel all of these will give us the emotional resilience that we need. And this allows us to take this transition. What we must not do is try and find approaches that try and cut out and get rid of the anxiety or the depression or despair. We need to transform those complex, uncomfortable feelings into a form of action. But they're the feelings that will fuel sustainable activism. I've talked a little bit about what young people are telling me. I think they're embodying the vulnerability of adults, and they need adults to tell the truth. And we need to use play and creative approaches. We need to listen to how children and young people feel and how they think before we take action. So this is talking about the need for internal and external activism. And the formula that I'm teaching people is to feel, then think, then breathe, then we understand with wisdom, then we can act. And again, this is back to this argument about sustainable activism. Then we have the possibility of transforming this anxiety and distress into understanding, empathy, compassion, courage, community, awareness, connection, belonging, meaning, care, and aliveness. It's my pain that connects me with the young people in the Maldives in Nigeria who are suffering now. Because psychology really needs to be studied alongside the planet. We have to remember that we're part of this nature. And the reality is psychologically living fully in the world, and finding these sustainable solutions collectively means to also feel the anxiety that goes with this territory of being a vulnerable human being. That's the big lesson for us. Thank you.
Caroline, thank you very much indeed. That was very helpful, and I'd be delighted if you would send me the slides and I will circulate them widely. As I say, we have, well, lots of interested people here locally. We also have 250,000 WI members, many of whom are climate ambassadors. So it's a really strong message to put out. And thank you very much for coming. Now, Graham Plunkett, I would like to welcome Graham Plunkett, who grew up in Penzance and attended Humphrey Davy Grammar School for Boys. So just as an aside, Graham, I grew up in St Ives and attended the County Grammar School for Girls, Penzance. So we've had the same education. Jonathan is joining us, so that's really good. After a 30-year teaching career in the East Midlands, Cornwall and London, he now works as a senior school effectiveness officer for Cornwall Council, where he leads the curriculum advisor team. So welcome, Graham. Thank you for giving up your time.
Thank you very much. I mean, I had a talk prepared, but I think I'd just like to pick up on a couple of issues that have come up in other people's presentations, if that's okay, because they're worth building now.
Absolutely.
And particularly in B's excellent talk, the school buildings issue is an interesting one, because COVID has really foregrounded that issue for us, because we found that our building stock, and I'm not talking just about Cornwall here, but in England in particular, our building stock is not really fit for purpose in a lot of cases. But we often have very old school buildings where the corridors are narrow and the rooms are not laid out with modern learning in mind. They don't have air conditioning, they have Victorian windows or whatever, or 60s metal frame windows. So the whole bubbles thing with COVID has been really quite difficult. And I'm not sure that's the case in a lot of European countries where their building stock is more modern. Of course, we did have the opportunity with building schools for the future some time ago that to build eco-friendly schools, but it would have meant that huge investment that you mentioned, B, and at the time it wasn't doable. So I would hope more modern buildings that have been recently redeveloped and changed are better, but I'm not an expert on the school buildings. The local context is really important, and I'll come back to that in a minute in what I'm going to say about Cornwall. And I think the emotion as a driver that you mentioned is also really important. And we know children learn better, young people learn better when they're happy and when they can emotionally engage with stuff. And we all remember those times at school when we did something that emotionally affected us, often at school trips, drama productions, that kind of thing. And the older you get, the more you hang on to those rather than maths on a Thursday afternoon as memories. But I think the key thing here is that, as I'll show you in a minute, or talk to you about in a minute, most of the climate change agenda in the curriculum is in geography and science. And those aren't the subjects we normally associate with a lot of emotion. And I think that the key thing here would be to engage young people through art, drama, English, PSHE, RE, those subjects where people can be reflective and where teachers and young people can share reflection and actually within a framework that enables them to articulate emotion in a safe space and to work on that and to produce artifacts in art and so forth that reflect all of that. So I just wanted to pick all that up. And I think that thing you said, Caroline, about shifting the anxiety is really important. I was actually going to start with, when I was at school, the number one fear for young people was nuclear war. And young adult fiction was dominated by stories about post-apocalypse, post-nuclear landscapes, books like Zephyr Zachariah and things like that. And that's what we taught. And certainly debating society at school was often about nuclear warfare and disarmament. And sometimes about pollution, because pollution was the key environmental issue then. And of course, that's shifted and changed. So what I propose to do, if that's all right, is to say a little bit about the national curriculum and exam specs and what's currently being taught. Then go on to say a little bit about Cornwall and our work on curriculum in Cornwall. And then what I've been saying lately. And then finish by saying a little bit about some of our Cornish schools and their particular response. I hope that's okay. In fact, in 2013, the words climate change were changed to environmental change in the national curriculum. And I think that's an interesting point to pick up on straight away. It's a shift of nuance, isn't it? It shifts it away from climate to the environment more generally. And I think a lot of people, it's a softer notion, the environment somehow, than climate change. You know, as Caroline said, we've seen some really dramatic demonstrations of climate change, particularly the heat wave in Canada recently and other things, you know, that we've already mentioned. You know, the floods in London, in Crouch End and so on the other day, reminded me of the Boscastle flood very much, you know, very, very similar situation. But environmental change sounds more incremental. It sounds like, you know, erosion and other slow processes. In primary school, children are taught about how environments can change and how human action can result in these changes. It's in Key Stage 1, which is some of our smallest children, of course, Year 1. It's not explicit, but there's a topic in science, Key Stage 1, called seasonal change, where there will be an opportunity to introduce it. But of course, you don't want to introduce anxiety at such a young age. So perhaps quite rightly, the majority of climate change explicitly is held off until Key Stage 3, which is the beginning of secondary school. I'm aware I shouldn't use any acronyms. I'll try and avoid using acronyms, okay? So for example, in PSHE, Personal Social Health Education, in Year 4, climate change and environment lessons and active citizenship are explored. You know, so what can we, and that's active citizenship, what can we actually do about it? And I think that's really important to get that notion of, you know, this is something you can do something about. Although, Caroline will probably know more about this than me, could that encourage children to feel a bit powerless if they're not really sure how they can organise things, you know, because not every child is confident enough to go out and join an organisation, you know, like yours be, and so on. In lower Key Stage 2, we get more. So Years 3 and 4, we get the thing about environmental change, and the guidance says pupils should explore examples of human impact, both positive and negative, on environments. For example, the positive effects of nature reserves, ecologically planned parks or garden ponds, and the negative effects of population and development, litter or deforestation. That's lifted straight out of the national curriculum. And that does not put climate change really at the front of the agenda. It's positive, negative, positive, negative. So you're emphasising the positive effects of human action on the environment and relegating the negative effects to things that you could perhaps do something about: population, development, litter and deforestation, which, you know, okay, it's not explicitly climate change, is it? As we move on to in secondary school, Key Stage 3, geography, use of natural resources and climate change. Key Stage 3, science, the carbon dioxide, human activity and impact on climate is explicitly in there. How organisms affect and are affected by their environment, and so on, up through, but science pretty much all the way. I think one of the key things, though, is as you go through in the citizenship agenda, Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, so that's, you know, 11 to 16 in terms of age range, that in the citizenship specification, the talk about rights, roles and responsibilities of citizens, the role of Parliament and democracy, the role of citizens and parliaments in holding those in power in a government to account, action citizens can take in democratic electoral processes to influence decisions. All of that stuff is there, as well as the voluntary groups and so on. So, you know, but it's going to come down to teachers, their choice in teaching that, whether they're going to emphasise and focus upon something that is to do with climate change or not. You know, it doesn't have to be. And the RE specification, RE throughout generally, never mind specifications, but RE generally, stewardship is a really important aspect of RE as a distinct topic taught up to GCSE. And that notion of stewardship is, you know, God created the world for us to look after. And so you can get to a lot of very explicit teaching about environment, climate change, pollution, deforestation, etc., extinction events through the stewardship topic in RE. Okay, so again, a lot of that is down to schools. Schools have autonomy in deciding what they want to teach, so long as they teach the national curriculum as a bare minimum, default, if you like. The national curriculum document these days is quite thin. So Key Stage 1R is basically 2 paragraphs. So you build from that. So long as you do those 2 paragraphs, you can build onto that what you want to teach. So it's not particularly prescriptive. And academies have the freedom to build on top of that, but maintained schools do too, yeah? And you'll then end up with a more bespoke curriculum chosen by that school in terms of what knowledge they think children need to know. And there really is a big emphasis on knowledge these days. And the mantra from Ofsted is children need to know more and remember more. The question is, what do you want them to know more and remember more about? So let me tell you a bit about Cornwall then. As you may know, the Council of Europe recognised the Cornish as a national minority a few years back. And that means that the Cornish people have the right to have their culture preserved and developed and celebrated, and the Cornish language to be protected. And that's a significant change of status. And the Westminster government gave some money to Cornwall Council to work on that, on what's called the Cornish National Minorities Project, which will involve things like signage, dual language signage. There's a project called Go Cornish, which teaches Cornish in schools. And to some extent reviving the language and so on. My particular part of that is what's called Curriculum Cernywec, which is units about Cornwall, but it's a forward-looking curriculum. It's not about heritage, not about bards and mining in the 17th century and Poldark and all the rest of it. It's focused on Cornwall's place in the world today and going forward. So therefore, in our curriculum units, as we develop them, there will be a strong emphasis upon climate change and environment and the implications of sustainable farming, sustainable fishing, the revival of, say, lithium mining, and the climate and the effect of climate on Cornwall and sea level changes and so forth. All of that stuff can be part of the curriculum to give it that local context that Bea was talking about earlier. There are already RE units for Curriculum Cernywec. They've existed for some time. And they're about things like the Saints' Way and what it means to be a person of faith in Cornwall. But we're building on that for all curriculum subjects. And that's part of a Cornwall Council drive for what's called a belonging framework, which is about celebrating inclusion, communities and people's sense of identity. So that it's a wider agenda that the council is on. So I've already mentioned things like fishing sustainability, farming and stewardship of the countryside, alternative energy sources, ground source wave, wind power, transport infrastructure, the spaceport, much celebrated. Yes, will bring prosperity. What are the implications? Ofsted's view, coming towards the end of what I'm going to say now, I hope that's okay. Ofsted's view in 2020, Amanda Spielman, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, in her annual report said that the climate change issue should be science-led and not a moral debate, which is quite interesting, I think, because there are obviously some moral dimensions to climate change in terms of what we think is right and wrong in decision-making and so forth. But the 1996 Education Act is quite explicit because it says that there should be political impartiality in schools. So that's the tricky one, because political impartiality isn't necessarily moral impartiality, is it? And when it comes to ethical and moral decisions, in theory they should trump the short-term political decision. Yeah, talking about eternal values and long-term implications for future generations. So that's an interesting one. She said, treating schools as the great panacea of our time underlines the importance of education, but it doesn't make it any easier to run a school. And what she was saying was, let's not put the whole burden of this on schools. Let's not make schools feel that they have to address climate change through teaching children. It's a bigger issue for society than that. So I think on the face of it, it might have looked like she was trying to bat away the notion of schools dealing with climate change. But actually, I think she was saying, no, don't put the whole onus on teaching children, because children actually, as we know, are already on this issue, as we saw through school strikes and so forth. And we got some really good, she said, I think if it's not grounded in science, there is no real understanding underneath it, and it becomes a morality tale or something quasi-religious, which is quite interesting, I think. Local responses, we got some really good local responses. Four Lanes End School, which is down near Tor Point, was instrumental in getting the Red Noses for Red Nose Day changed from plastic to single-use plastic to a sustainable resort material instead. That's a tiny primary school, and they made a big change, and I think that's a really significant thing. Schools across Cornwall are involved in beach cleans. Schools across Cornwall have green teams. Recently, Mount Space School in Penzance, when they came back from lockdown, held a detox festival, which was about children returning from lockdown and coming back into the school community and recovering. But it was also focused on things like, what is soil, how does soil work, you know, about it was centered around an old oak tree on their site. And they used the notion of, I think it's called Fire for the Children, or the Children's Fire, which is a Native American idea about, you know, whenever a big decision is made, the elders should sit around the fire and think about what the implications are for the children. There are lots of schools that celebrate and use Climate Week as an opportunity to put things into the school curriculum and drop the curriculum maybe for a couple of days and do special events and so forth. So there's plenty happening. Whether it's focused enough in terms of your expectations is another matter. But there's no shortage of work being done on climate change. The question, I think, is how it's approached, perhaps in terms of answering those asks that you mentioned at the top of your talk, Bea. Done.
Thank you, Graham, very much. It's been very, very informative, and it takes me back, I think, to the Teach the Future Climate Education Emergency Bill, which was presented to Gavin Williamson in February 2020, which was not a good moment for starting any new initiative. But their big ask really is that teachers need to be educated about climate change and about delivering climate change. And as long as they are not, then if it's all fairly optional, then, as you say, some schools will do brilliantly, like Trithrol or Four Lanes or a lot of our local schools. Yeah. And some schools will do nothing. And when we were starting to think about taking this forward, and we're hoping to take forward a WI resolution to support the Climate Education Emergency Bill, we had a little poll amongst our own grandchildren. I mean, maybe only a dozen, but across England and Wales. And a lot of them do nothing. They do a little bit in science, and then just move on, and that's the end of it. So if you've got inspirational teachers and a structure like the one in Cornwall where you're able to do this, that's fine. But lots of school teachers, I've got this thing from 70% of school teachers feel they haven't received adequate training to educate students about climate change. And there was a conference of the parties number 20 in Italy last month, where a consortium of organisations, including Teach the Future, was asking for this to receive proper consideration. So I sort of feel, and I know there's really good work going on in Cornwall because I've seen it happen, but I feel that if this is going to happen nationally, there's lots of work to do. Yeah. So thank you very much, and all your talks have been really, really helpful for me, partly in taking forward this resolution. So I think, Megan, we have 2 questions in the Q&A. A very long one from Melissa Benyon. So does Melissa want to put her questions to Caroline? Would that be a good way to do it?
Yeah, let me just invite her to speak.
Hello there, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello. Thank you everybody for your time and preparation that you put into engaging on these sort of platforms with everybody. It really is appreciated by us invisible audience out here. Always a pleasure to hear you speak, Caroline. And I had a question for you about the denial that you spoke about, which is I was wondering about the demonstration of that at an organisational level or within authorities, with adults sort of appearing to encourage each other that actually we are doing enough, because if we weren't, the kind of consideration of that is too much to consider, and they're dealing with their own insecurity and guilt. An example I feel yesterday is that Cornwall Council voted against supporting the environmental bill and the climate and ecological emergency bill, which was really disappointing, given that nobody actually debated against it. But a cynical person might consider this was associated with the political landscape that the CEE bill frames, which is basically much more pressure on business and government to make urgent, meaningful changes. But I wondered what your position was as a psychologist, and whether you think this is a sort of form of peer-supported denial, and they really want to think that we're doing enough. And when someone says, "Oh, we are doing enough because we put a bit of money in this and a bit of money in that," that they kind of pat themselves on the back and say, "No, that's okay," because they can't really face the option that they're not doing enough.
Absolutely, Melissa. Brilliant questions that you've put here in the Q&A. Absolutely, it is a form of denial, but it's a particular form of denial. It's a disavowal. And disavowal is more of the psychological defense that we're dealing with now, where people say, oh yeah, we really must take action on the climate biodiversity crisis. It's really serious, and look at all these good things we're doing. But, you know, gosh, I can't wait for lockdown to be over because I want to fly to Spain on holiday. And you just think, how can those two things coexist in the same brain? So disavowal means that we minimize and we disallow and we hide behind, as you just said yourself, this narrative that we are taking action, and we pretend that we're taking action. And in doing so, we completely avoid the significance of the urgency of the action that's needed. The short answer is it's lying, basically. It's very dishonest. It is organizational denial. There is some overwhelm in there. I think people don't know how to navigate the complexity of this. But I think you asked in the question about, you know, I think there's more guilt and shame involved in this. I think it's really tough on adults to say sorry and say, this is how badly we failed. And not to be blamed for this, but to recognize our culpability. We've all failed. And the generations before us have failed. And the generations before them have failed. And in psychotherapy terms, everybody comes into psychotherapy, I'm generalizing horribly, but lots of people come in saying, I've got all these problems and I really want to sort them, but I don't want to have to make too many changes, please. Right? This is human nature. You know, we have to change, but we don't want it to be too disruptive. I'm afraid this has to be disruptive. And until we face the reality of that level of disruption and discomfort that is necessary, then we are not going to take action. And it's only when things get bad enough that we will take this action. That's why I place quite a lot of faith in these large court cases that are going on, because I think legal pressure is going to be the significant thing that makes the difference. And what it's leading to, if we don't do this, is a form of moral injury, particularly in children and young people. So it is a psychological betrayal of children and young people, where adults actually know what they should be doing and they're still failing to do it. And that is painful. And the only way to deal with that is to say sorry. And to your other question, very quickly, of course, adults need the education, but I think we need a very broad understanding of what we mean by education. I work with parent support groups. We're running workshops where we move in between traditional forms of education and self-support and self-education. We need new models of education and psychology to help us find our way through this. And those can be very creative, but I think a lot of them have to be supported, but then self-generating. And it's that makes you feel better. The parents I was meeting with last night said, taking action makes us feel better. So supporting parent groups and education groups and charities and schools to do these things is crucial. The other thing, just very, very quickly on age, my research is with children as young as 4 and 5. And age 4 and 5 is the right age to start talking to children about climate change. Don't leave it later than that, because they're online. They're finding out for themselves. They're educating themselves. They've got older brothers and sisters. I did a research interview. I will shut up, I promise, in 2 minutes. I did a research interview a couple of years ago, just before Christmas, with a 10-year-old whose dad met me and said, oh, I don't think he knows anything about climate change. Don't think he's got much to say. Within minutes, this child was describing climate change as like a crocodile the size of a continent crawling across the earth, eating and rotting from the inside out, and its scales were falling off, and Dad was traumatized. The 10-year-old, we asked him after, we said, how long have you been thinking about climate change? He said, oh, did it 3 years ago in school. This child had been knowing about this for 3 years and not been talking about it. So really it's about opening up those conversations. So in the same way as you wouldn't get divorced from your partner or not talk to your 4 and 5-year-old about the divorce or about, you know, somebody in the family dying, you wouldn't pretend to them that this person hasn't died. That would be very psychologically confusing for that child. In the same way, we have to be talking to them about the reality of climate change right from that early age in ways that they can tolerate and understand. That 10-year-old said after that interview, he said that was the most fun he'd had in weeks. Dad was traumatized, 10-year-old had fun because I got him storytelling and playing and then imagining this. So this is a really safe way to engage quite young children. So I am going to stop talking and hand over. I'd really like to hear what Bea and Graham think about these questions as well.
Right.
Thank you, Caroline.
Yes, thank you, Caroline. Graham, did you want to come back on this one?
I would, yeah, I think you're right, actually. And thank you for that insight into how young you can go with this. I think that's really important. And I think if that's the case, then yes, we should be doing it. But as I said earlier, the national curriculum doesn't give us that room by explicit. It's not in there explicitly, you need to teach this. So I think, you know, the reception teacher, the year 1 teacher could easily manage it through the choice of reading books. And as children progress through the reading scheme, there are some very good picture books that they could pick up and use. Then when you get on to topic work in primary school, certainly there's scope there, and increasing that topic work is now called geography or science as you go up through primary school, because that's the expectation from Ofsted. So again, if the expectation is we teach explicit subjects, then that does give the opening for more explicit teaching of this aspect of those subjects. So yeah.
Thank you. Bea, did you want to say something about it?
I would just like to touch on the second question that Melissa had put in the chat, kind of talking about how education is an enormous topic, but about how grown-ups should approach it. And Teach the Future is actually in September. We are hosting or starting a project called Teach the Teacher, where on inset days, students will actually go into their own schools or local schools, and they will hold a whole presentation that we are currently working on with other organisations about how to approach climate education, how the students would like to be taught about climate education, but also directing them towards other educational resources. So not in any way belittling the teachers or almost patronizing them, saying you don't know anything about this, because that isn't a way to approach it. It's saying that if the teachers have a duty of care, and if we emphasize the fact that, as Caroline has been showing, that not acting on climate change is having a negative impact on students' mental health, then I believe or hope that teachers would really feel motivated to inform themselves.
Thank you, Bea. We have another question from Rowena Swallow about whether other schools in Penrith developed similar approaches as Trisel, which, yes, is wonderful. I live just down the road from Trisel School. Rowena, would you like to ask your question of whomsoever?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Yes, my children were all very fortunate in going to Trythall School, and I think it was, back in the day, a real standout. I'm now currently doing some work with an organisation that I work alongside, which is a community interest company, to work with our local secondary school, which is St Ives, in trying to look at a sort of climate education programme, which we're calling St Ives Crew, which is like a change makers programme. So I'm particularly interested to perhaps follow up, if at all possible, with B about this. But there were a lot of things that Graham was also saying, which were to do with the continuity from primary level onwards, and the way that then feeds into the secondary experience, which I think would be a useful conversation to have there as well. And I was just interested to know whether, in the experience of the panel, there are other schools in Penwith that are following the sort of Trythall model, if I could put it that way, or even different models, where there are other interesting examples that it would be good for us to be able to study in this context.
I do know that a Marazine school does a lot of work in this context. Graham probably knows more than I do.
Well, I'm not sure I do, actually. We've not done a systematic analysis of what is a Marazine teacher there, but yeah, Marazine is a good school in these terms. We haven't done a systematic evaluation. I can only talk about anecdotes about schools I know of, and I gave the Mounts Bay example because that's one that I heard about week. Actually, I was talking to the principal about it, and that sounded like a really good project. The emphasis there, coming back from lockdown, was not on catch up to, address deficits in English and maths. It was about children's emotional and mental health well-being, and getting them back into school and reforging connections and reforging community links, and using that as a way of talking about the issues that matter to them, which obviously climate change is high on that agenda. So as a secondary school, I'd give Mounts Bay as an example, but I wouldn't like to say what goes on elsewhere, to be honest.
Thank you.
And I noticed Virginia Davis is in the audience. Virginia, are you able to tell us a bit more about primary schools in Penwith? Virginia's on mute at the moment, Megan.
Yeah, I have asked her to speak. She may not be there.
Not to worry, I didn't want to put her on the spot. Okay, well, do we have, I don't think we've got any more questions in the Q&A.
Could I just ask a question of Caroline before I...
Oh, please, yes, before you rush off.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you, by the way, for really interesting talks. Caroline, I wanted to ask about grief, actually. I know a lot of people within Extinction Rebellion talk about grief a lot, and I think they're talking about grief with reference to loss of species and things like that. But I think we might make more headway with the broader population if it was grief to do with loss of fast cars and aeroplane flights and stuff like that. Have you any thoughts on that? People need to work through that.
I think that's really interesting. I guess I would start with loss. I think what we have to face is a disillusionment, which is part of that grief. And it's this disillusionment in this story that we've swallowed of eternal perpetual growth. And the eternal perpetual growth can just carry on and on and on and on and on. So we can always have more. We can have bigger cars. We can have more of this and more of that. And that somehow that we won't run out of resources in the planet. It's a very narcissistic, I'm afraid. Sorry to sound like such a psychotherapist, but I am one, so bear with me. It's a very sort of entitled way of viewing the world. There's always more and more and more and more. It becomes a kind of hunger for more. And what it does is it gets us further and further and further and further away from what's most important. And when a lot of people were talking about having a taste of reflecting on that as a result of lockdown and COVID, suddenly people were reflecting on their values. What was more important was connection with community, family, starting to appreciate the nature, the environment. And the love of these things was replacing this drive to go out and consume and grow. And I think it was making people feel better about their lives. And that reconnection with what's really important, I think ultimately is really important for people's psychological well-being and mental health. So yes, there is a loss of the cars, but actually it's a loss of the illusion that those things will make us happy, because you can get more and more and more and more and still be deeply unhappy. And that's what brings a lot of people to psychotherapy, is you've got everything you think you want and you're still miserable. And it's actually the loss of some of those things that makes us re-engage with spiritual truths, with the soul's journey, with love, with friendships, with family, with nature, our environment, with our community. And there's a calmness about that then. We feel better. But it's paradox. You know, human beings are very complicated. We think we want more, and actually, you know, it makes us miserable because then we've got to get even more. So that is a complex answer, but you know, it's not the cars that make people happy. It's the love that they get from feeling as if they belong. We all want, at the end of the day, to feel understood and listened to, and that we belong. And if we could recreate that, people wouldn't miss the cars.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. I'm going to have to leave now.
Oh, well, thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Johnson.
Thanks.
Nice to see you. Well, do we have any more questions or any more comments that anybody would like to make?
We did have one from Maggie, which Caroline has answered, but we could ask the other panelists.
Yes, right.
If I ask Maggie to speak.
Hi. Yeah, I'm very grateful to you giving such excellent talks, and I fear that that although what you're saying is very sensible, I don't see it's about to happen any more than it's happening with the adult population. Yeah, my question was really whether there is much work going on with children with their parents. If I were a parent or a grandparent who could cope with perhaps a regular after-school slot, perhaps once a week, which was seen as part of a course where the child and the adult go through this together, I think that would be rather a good way to do it. I just wondered whether anything like that is happening and whether there's any possibility that it might if it isn't. Thank you.
Can I start?
Yes,
on that?
please, Graham.
Yeah. I'm not sure whose remit that would fall under. And if that was an expectation on schools, that would come back to the Amanda Spielman point about not expecting schools to be a panacea. It would be logical to expect schools to do it because that's where parents and children are going to meet. But I'm not sure schools would have the capacity or the resources, given the financial situation and, you know, the challenges of COVID, to actually put that on. And how would you guarantee that each school had an expert people to deliver that training or that course or that workshop? I think it's a lovely idea, but it's a really quite ambitious one, I think. But I think it's got scope as a way forward, definitely.
Right, thank you. Bea or Caroline, do you have any comments to make?
I've just put a link in the chat to the Climate Psychology Alliance resource pages for young people and for parents and for teachers. So it's all open access, just go and help yourself to them. What we're developing is a model of climate cafes, where we're bringing young people together, children, we'll be already running them for parents. We will be developing them for parents and children to attend together. So I think these things need to be outside the curriculum, but I don't see why they can't form part of a kind of community resource that schools support. I don't see how you're necessarily going to be able to put that into the curriculum. And I think that might just break teachers if we try and ask them to do even more like that, to be honest. But I think we could, you know, I've been working with quite a lot of schools doing arts projects. The Climate Psychology Alliance will come out and teach you how to set up and run climate cafes for adults and young people and children. So, you know, we will do this. You just contact us and ask us to do this. I think it's about using schools and the educational process creatively and working with groups like CPA who will just come out and provide these resources. And then we can try and fundraise for them. And then we'll teach you how to do them and then we can roll them out more broadly.
Well, thanks, Caroline. That's really interesting because that brings us full circle to the February meeting where Catherine Lewis was talking about the CPA and the climate cafes. And I did actually mention them at the Town Council meeting yesterday as well as something we're doing in Penzance.
Oh, brilliant. I know Catherine's been talking to Rebecca in CPA about developing them in Cornwall. So yeah. But we've also got these resources for children, young people, parents and teachers. So, and I'll send you the resources that I've written for Learning Climate Action Week. So, you know, we want to support you in developing these things.
So would climate cafes always be virtual, or, I mean, would there be any mileage in setting up a permanent safe place where people can go and talk about climate change?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They should be face-to-face where possible.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because there are not many places like that. Bea, do you have anything to say about this?
I would just like to say that I think Maggie's idea would be amazing. However, there are some impracticalities, and as I experienced the school day, and it is incredibly hectic, and personally I'm not entirely sure if with student schedules with revising and learning and parent schedules with working that it would always work. However, I think that if we provide the education on these subjects to whatever year groups we are targeting, then children, or the majority of children, have a natural curiosity, and they will go home to their parents or carers and they will say, oh, this is what we learned about today, and why did you do this? And it will start the conversation. So I think it doesn't always need to be in a controlled setting in school. I think even at the dinner table or just anything like that, just talking in a normal conversation about these real life issues will really help put them into context and get parents thinking about how they can be role models for their children.
Good, thank you.
We did a project with primary school a few years ago, and we grew a baby humpback whale with 2,500 crocus bulbs on their school playing field. Awesome project. And then all the children got their parents to come and look at it. We created this gigantic artwork, which will be there forever. I mean, I think using those kind of big art programs, which are interactive, and the children can get their parents to come, and then you can develop those conversations around it, might also be quite nice ways of doing that.
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know whether my microphone's on, but thank you.
Yes, it is. Huh? Well, do we have any more questions?
There's no more in the chat, and I don't think anyone has their hand up. No.
Ah, the Great Big Green Week. Yes, well, I should think that, I mean, with the support and information that we would need, we could certainly, I would have thought, run a climate cafe during the week of the Great Big Green Week. For those who don't know about the Great Big Green Week, this is a climate coalition initiative which aims to get every participating member of the climate coalition doing something, from planting an acorn to having a huge public meeting during the week of 18th to 26th of September in the run up to COP26.